We can now get started. Excellent. So, welcome. Thanks very much for coming, and a special thank you to our two speakers who've travelled to be with us and speak to us today. I'm expecting that we're going to aim to close around 9:30. We'll see how it goes a bit with that, but not really extend beyond that. Anyway, I'll do both the introductions at the start. My name, by the way, if you haven't met me, I'm Philip Goodchild. I'm Professor of Religion and Philosophy at this university. So first we'll hear from Abdullah al-Andalusi. He's an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. Apart from many appearances on television and at many universities and community centres, he has also co-founded the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, a forum that promotes open dialogue and critical debate between thinkers, academics, politicians, and public speakers. And secondly, we're going to hear from Arif Ahmed, who's reader in philosophy at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Gonville and Caius there. He mainly works on rational choice, but also has an interest in religion and has debated this matter with some very prominent names. The names William Lane Craig, Tariq Ramadan, Rowan Williams may not be so well known to all of you, but they're very well known to me. I'm delighted that we've got both speakers with us. We'll have a presentation first from Abdullah, and then there will be a response from Arif, and then a 5-minute response from Abdullah, 5 minutes from Arif, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the Nottingham Student Union and the Atheist, Secularist and Humanist Society for inviting me here to speak. I'd also like to thank my interlocutor, Arif Ahmed, for attending today and facilitating this debate. Today's debate topic is quite a double-barreled one. Is God necessary to explain reality and provide a consistent basis for values? I intend to demonstrate that not only is it God necessary to explain reality, but also that no consistent basis for morals and values is possible without God. Let's start by mentioning a basic question. What is reality? And why does it need an explanation? Reality is simply the existence of finite and limited things as opposed to the existence of nothing. If nothing exists, then no explanation would be required. However, if something exists and it is limited and defined in extent, form and composition, it would need an explanation. And by explanation, we mean cause. So to explain the occurrence of something is actually to explain its cause. This constitutes the burden of explanation that is upon both theists and atheists and agnostics alike. Now, contrary to what is popularly believed, the method of exploring and mapping out tangible reality that we can sense, i.e. science, is not necessary to ultimately explaining this question, since the need to explain reality is just as much pressing to two goldfish whose entire universe is contained in a goldfish bowl as it is to humans who gaze up at the sky and extend their gaze only as far as has been traversed by light, limited by the speed of light and the age of the universe. We'd not be able to work this out outside of the universe, what created it, by merely studying the contents of the universe, any more than a goldfish would be able to work out what or made the goldfish bowl by studying the walls in the bowl or the number of pebbles and plastic seaweed in it. When we ask what created something, we are actually asking what defined its form, limitations and characteristics. To define something, definis, in Latin means to met out its limitations and boundaries. Everything that has boundaries, limits, form and finitude was defined by something else, whether it's an external force or by the sum of its internal consistence and components. Put simply, we know for certain that if I was to hold a rock or pick any rock from the surrounding area, we would know that the rock had been created or made because it has a shape and a composition. It either defines itself before it existed, which is rationally absurd, or it doesn't have any limitations and is infinite, but then why would it have shape? The only conclusion left is that any rock we might pick or view was made by something else, whether a mindless process or a thing with agency. If a rock wasn't formed with cooling lava or meteorite strikes or weathering or by artificial hands, would it have any shape? No, because it wouldn't have been shaped or formed, and therefore it simply wouldn't exist. Likewise, reality, with its dimensions and objects, and their recurrent and consistent behaviors we call laws. We have to ask what ultimately defined or determined these properties that we observe. This is because we need an ultimate explanation for the sum total of finite and limited reality. There must be an ultimate explanation or cause, since it is rationally impossible for there to be an infinite regress of finite causes prior to our existence. As put simply, we'd never reach this moment in this infinite regress. If my journey from London to Nottingham today had taken an infinite amount of time and required I'll try to buy a car, required my car to traverse an infinite amount of distance, would we ever arrive in Nottingham? No. Likewise, we know that a changing universe had a beginning, because if it was eternal, we'd have to wait an infinite amount of time to reach any moment of existence. Consequently, this moment and all of us would never exist. Furthermore, what's the essence of the smallest particle? What's it made out of? Again, if there were an infinite series of matryoshka doll or Russian nesting doll-like elements, no particles would ever exist. At some point, we have to concede that something is sustaining all matter and energy, whatever we mean by energy. Therefore, the only explanation that remains is that the ultimate explanation or cause of finite reality is that there is another reality in addition to our own, an infinite reality, opposite of finite reality, that gave rise to and currently sustains our reality. This force is infinite, unchanging, and without shape, rendering it the exact opposite of a finite thing, and therefore in need of nothing to define it, form it, shape it, or give it characteristics. This leaves us with a remaining question: is it mindless, or is it an agent? I.e., does it have will or intention? This infinite force, being the first cause, we deduce rationally, could not be compelled by any internal, external mechanism to create the universe and us. It follows that it intended to create our finite reality, and if it has intention, then it has will and could not be mindless. This reality, which is both without limits, finitude, or precursors, and which possesses intent, can be called anything you want. However, since we're speaking English, I'd like to suggest an English name for this, and that I think would best fit, and I think this would be called God. In light of this, we are rationally moved to conclude that God is necessary to explain our reality, or while their explanations fail to provide a rationally consistent alternative, and the individual who is dogmatically insistent on denying God, for whatever personal reasons bedevil them, is forced to simply deny either reality exists at all, or that we shouldn't believe in anything that can't be directly seen, despite the fact that they are happy to do so, with much cognitive dissonance in every other area of their lives, including in the sciences. This is clearly evident by the fact that, aside from agnostics, the idea of God is not even considered a plausible alternative explanation or theory by many professing to be atheists. And the idea that we can deduce things beyond what we can see by looking at the finite nature of anything that we do see is the basic premise of all thinking and the sciences. A geologist knows when they look at a rock that the rock has been created, as much as a layman looking at the same rock would also conclude that the rock was made by something else. And that's merely due to the rock not being infinite, but being a certain shape and form. This is what we common rationality, and it's the basis behind science. If you throw this out, then you throw out the basis of all science, thinking, and rationality. But furthermore, morality cannot exist without meaning and purpose. The existence of God and God's intended creation of all finite reality means, at the very least, that everything that exists in our finite reality was intended. This intention means that everything that exists and existed and will exist is intended and therefore becomes imbued with purpose and meaning. Words only have meaning because they have an intended signification or information behind what they convey. Likewise, our finite reality has meaning and intention behind it. This becomes significant as a basis for all other concepts of meaning. The purpose of a car defines its meaning. The purpose, as we know for cars, are transportation. If a car gets you from A to B, it is a good car. But if a car breaks down, it is a bad car. The concepts, or should I say the words good and bad, can only be understood by measuring an action according to whether it fulfills the intention behind the created thing. If humans were intended, then we now have a basis to measure actions as either good or bad. If humans are not intended, then our finite reality, and that our finite reality had inflationary constants and electromagnetic forces finely tuned to produce life as a matter of pure coincidence, which is a highly risible concept, then there is no good and bad because human life has no intention behind it, and the universe, or finite reality, has no intention behind it. The only good and bad in such reality is merely the possible and the impossible. Now, I'm not saying that this makes massacres, killings, rape, colonization, and exploitation become good. I'm merely pointing out that if there is no meaning to human life, it doesn't make these actions anything at all. The idea of human rights, or natural rights as they were first called during the so-called Western Enlightenment, was the idea that observing the universe built by the Creator could teach us the intention of the Creator for human beings, and therefore give us an idea of the natural rights that humans should enjoy. Jeremy Bentham declared the idea of natural rights to be nonsense on stilts, and argued instead for a utilitarian perspective where actions were only judged based purely by reference to the achievement of a desired goal by any human in question. Human desire then became the only measure of what is good or bad, and herein lies the problem. You see, it's not that atheists can, and no one's arguing that atheists cannot perform actions that would be considered moral by people who believed in divinely established natural rights. The observation I'm merely pointing to is that unless atheists embrace mental compartmentalization and hold on to dogmatically morals bequeathed to them from a religious legacy within their societies, or they don't question the mental conditioning their parents implemented on them to condition their adult behavior, they have no argument to justify or refute any desire they or anyone else possesses, whether it fits in with accepted social norms or goes outside them. What remains to atheists is not morality, but culture and childhood conditioning. However, today's debate is not about the intellectual justification for morals. It's actually about motivational consistency in morals, and it's about whether God is necessary to provide a consistent basis for values. So let's examine motivational consistency. Motivational consistency means that a moral standard possesses the ability to motivate someone consistently to live and behave by moral codes regardless of the situation or inconvenience. The trick here is to ensure that people act consistently with the moral code in like-for-like situations that do not depend on their personal convenience. Now, atheists or materialist moralists may argue that there might not exist a higher objective morality outside the material world. However, we can construct, based on a social contract, a type of list of morals by which we can establish society for the greater benefit of all. To wit, they play a game to construct society based on what is called lightened self-interests, and asks everyone to play by the same rules and allow everyone to achieve their common interests. But this relies on two assumptions. It assumes that everyone starts off with equal capability and equal starting positions, something that human realities just don't bear out. And it also assumes that the rules will never get in the way of people's interests, and that people will never be tempted to cheat or use shortcuts when they are confident no one is looking. What if the people playing this game were unequal players, and some could work the rules well enough to gain so much of their interests that others end up without attaining theirs? Like, for example, the wealth disparity we see in capitalism. Some people will have more wealth than others. Some people have more opportunity and connection. Some have more skill than others. Some are more attractive than others. Apparently, this individual in California, Elliot Rodger, was so frustrated with the fact that he couldn't get any girls that he decided to take out his wrath upon individuals on the street by killing women and men, or jocks as he calls them, because he believes that he was the perfect gentleman and he couldn't get women, and women were only interested in the bad guys, and so he decided that was unfair, and so he decided to kill people based on what he considered to be unfair, and what he did was obviously grotesque. However, we have to look, what incentive did those people who see others getting ahead of them have to follow the rules that are clearly benefiting some people more than others? Furthermore, what about people who see that their interest may be reasonably attained by cheating? In either case, we would expect materially motivated people to see it as wise to accept. So would we expect people who are materially motivated to see it as wise, accepting losses in the service of a greater good? Well, the communists couldn't motivate people to do actions for the greater good without profit incentive, despite the fact they threatened them with gulags and other such quote-unquote inducements. And look at what about in criminology? Criminologists have a concept or a model called rational choice theory, whereby they explain that many criminal activities are done because the criminal perceives it to be rational to attain their interests. People have often heard the saying, it's only a crime if you get caught, or rules are made to be broken. If our ancestors would go out for hunting, accepting that there would be risk in doing so in order to get a benefit, then why do we expect modern humans to not use to play with risk to get their interests too? Especially if they feel they are disenfranchised, or that they feel that they couldn't, that they didn't want to work the 9-to-5 slog and they want to get rich quickly. And people would argue, well, if everyone did that, society would collapse on itself, and who could countenance or justify that action when, if everyone was doing it, society would collapse? But here's the assumption: you can break the rules without society collapsing. You can break the rules, you can cheat, you can lie, you can defraud. If no one catches you, then society doesn't collapse. Heck, even if you do the crime, you're caught, society doesn't collapse. So the arguing that people would abstain from doing bad actions because society would collapse and therefore the common interest would be against that is not really kind of seen in actual practice. We also see that people might have self-interest without any consequence. For example, some rich capitalists might be okay to pollute the world and make more profit because, heck, it's not them that's going to live in the polluted world in the future. So they don't see any consequence in their lifetime, and they don't see much motivation to prevent or to not take advantage. What about belief in justice? I would actually argue the concept of justice has killed more people than any other concept. Just the word justice itself has killed more people than any other concept in human history. And envy and jealousy between people arise because people believe that we are all equal. So if someone is richer or is more attractive or is more intelligent, you see envy and jealousy rise amongst people. And many experiments have shown that when people are playing a game and some people are getting ahead in that game, that people will expend resources to actually undermine their competitors in that game, to actually undermine each other. And many experiments have shown this. So how do you get rid of this? Well, you can't, because nature exists in natural inequalities. You can't get rid of them. And what about if you're a powerful nation against weaker nations? What could you argue against American colonialists to not colonize the New World? You couldn't argue anything against them. They got away with it. What about those who colonized Australia? They got away with it, and they benefit from it, and their descendants benefit from it, and there's nothing you could argue against them because they had no consequence to their actions. In fact, human history is a litany of tribes oppressing other tribes because it doesn't destroy their own society by attacking other countries around the world. And so they do it because they might have a benefit in it. They see it as a benefit, resources, land, territory, and they pursue that benefit without consequence. But just to kind of bring it in, which I'll kind of conclude, we also see that if you base ideologies around human convenience, and you base rights around human convenience, well then the God of human convenience giveth, and the God of human convenience taketh away. We saw debates in America about torture, whether torture should be legalized. Well, not legalized, sorry, it shouldn't be prohibited, because they said if it saves lives, why not, is the argument. And the debate was whether it works or not that it goes against people's natural rights, because as Jeremy Bentham said, natural rights is nonsense on stilts. So then the only argument you could ever bring is, does it work? Doesn't it work? We see secular kind of tolerance only applies when it's convenient. But we see both John Locke writing in his book, ironically titled A Letter on Toleration, John Milton, as well as many others, talk about that you do not tolerate minorities where you can't be sure that they are loyal to the state. They don't have a right of toleration. You shouldn't tolerate these minorities. And you see that throughout European history, post-Enlightenment, minorities have repeatedly been subject to suspicion, persecution, and oppression because they were perceived to be a threat to our civilization. to Western civilization. Heck, even my colleague here, Ahmad, described the Islam as the greatest political threat in the West today, constituting a global threat, and it represents an extreme threat to our life in the West. So then what do you do with your Muslim minority if you think Islam is a threat to the West? Well, rationally speaking, you would limit a minority if you think they were truly represented, or they followed an ideology which truly represented a threat to your civilization. And the same was said about the Jews, and the same was said about the Catholics prior to that. We've seen this repetition in the so-called post-Enlightenment, secular, tolerant West. Because rights are only as good as they are convenient when you get rid of natural rights. We see Sam Harris, actually another atheist, who justified the possibility of torture if it saves lives. We see John Rawls, famous secular liberal John Rawls, argue that he called it the supreme emergency exemption. He said there are occasions when you can bomb civilians, target civilians, if you reckon you will win, it will help you win the war. And he cites World War II as his paradigm. You can't say John Rawls is a fringe liberal. You can't say it. He's actually paradigmatic as a secular liberal. Of course, one could also argue that why tolerate religious belief if religious belief is false consciousness, as the communists argued, and that religion is dangerous. Many atheists argue that religion is dangerous. So then why tolerate it? Because the idea of freedom is a metaphysical idea, it's not a physical idea. So where is the basis if it's no longer convenient to offer freedom? Which is why we see many states become more authoritarian when they face with terrorism or threats or what have you, or blown out of proportion, of course, because they can then justify to their people, we have to take these rights away because they're no longer convenient. That is the God of human convenience. Religion, on the other hand, offers inducements that are counterintuitive, forgiving enemies, forgiving those who trespass against you, believing that God will right wrongs and will ask and account those people who've been given more in this life. Don't get jealous, because God will ask more to those who've been given more. So everything balances out in a hereafter. We see that, and this is the point what I'm trying to make, is not that religious morality is compatible with secular liberalism, and we're going to probably hear this discussion that many religious beliefs are not compatible with secular liberalism. I don't really care about compatibility with secularism at all whatsoever. My only argument is consistency. And we see that religious morality, at least with some religions, has greater potential to offer a more consistent set of morals, because these morals are based on divinely inspired or divine morals and ethics which are not subject to human convenience. Whereas if you base morality on human convenience, well, then that can change, and it does frequently change. The universe is chaos. Therefore, any morality born of materialist ideologies would also be inconsistent, inconstant, and full of contradictions. If you make as your basis for morality human convenience, then what the God of human convenience giveth, then the God of human convenience can equally and as lightly taketh away. Therefore, if we are to have a consistent basis for values and morality, other than the capricious, mercurial vagaries of human convenience, then morality and values must be pinned or anchored on a basis that possesses objective existence, which can only be the intent of the will of a creator. This can only be God, and therefore God is not only necessary to explain reality, but provide a consistent basis for values. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Abdullah, for a stimulating talk. So I shall be talking for the next, maybe not quite as long as the previous talk, but I will be talking for about 10-15 minutes about some of the very interesting points that have been brought up in the last talk. First, I shall say a little bit about the argument concerning the necessity for God's existence as a means of explaining reality. Then I shall say something about whether we need God as a basis for values. To remove all suspense, my answer to both of those questions is no. I'll start with the argument concerning whether we need God to explain reality. Now, the argument as I understood it from Abdullah was that, well, it relied on two premises. I mean, one of the premises was that whatever is limited needs some sort of explanation as to how it got the way that it did. And then the other premise was that reality itself is limited. From these two assumptions, it does follow that reality needs some sort of explanation. And then the next step was that the explanation has to be infinite, and it also has to have intention. Though I wasn't quite clear exactly how that step followed, but I will say a bit more about that. And then that was the thing that was defined for us as God. And then we moved on to the issue about values, which I'll come on to shortly. So just turning to those assumptions, first of all, that whatever's limited needs some sort of explanation. It might be what motivates that idea. I mean, I think that may not be false, but what motivates that idea is the belief that nothing can be arbitrary, that the way things are, there has to be some explanation of why they're that way rather than some other way. Now, we're familiar in modern science with plenty of counterexamples to that kind of principle. So if you think, for instance, concerning quantum phenomena, let's say, why did this atom decay at this particular time rather than half a second earlier or half a second later? It's not just true, but it's part of the theory that there's no explanation for that. This is something that just happened. It was a finite, limited event, and it just happened without having any particular causal explanation of why it happened then rather than earlier or later. Now, there's no reason in principle why that sort of arbitrariness shouldn't in fact arise at a much larger scale. So that the only answer to some questions about, for instance, why are the laws of nature as they are, why is the universe and exactly the way that it is, we can explain it in terms of more and more basic laws, but at some point we'll have to say, well, that's just the way things are, and that's just the way reality is. If there is some sort of contradiction that follows from that assumption, then it would be interesting to know what it is. If there isn't any contradiction that follows from it, then I want to know what the premises are, what other argument we can give for this assumption that whatever is limited needs to have some sort of causal explanation. The next assumption, which was that reality itself is limited, was based on an argument which I've always found rather curious, which is that there can be no infinite sequence of events going backwards in time, because then we'd never have got to the present moment. That seems to have been the argument. To give you an idea of why this is wrong, just think about the analogy for space. Suppose someone said, space can't be infinite, because then how could you ever get to the present, to this place? Now that seems wrong. So now it's an interesting question why the argument should seem plausible for time but not for space. Now think of another example. Let's think about an infinite sequence of events going forwards in time. There seems to be no difficulty in that. There seems to be no incoherence or impossibility in having, starting from now, a sequence of events that goes on forever. Why then should the mere reversal in time turn perfectly reasonable possibility into some kind of incoherence? Well, I submit that it doesn't. And if the question is, if time started an infinite amount of time ago, how did we ever get to the present moment? That's a fallacy, because we never started an infinite time ago. There was no infinite amount of time ago. It's just for every finite number of seconds, there was something that many seconds ago. So there's no time at which you could point and say that moment was infinitely many seconds before the present one. A third point, which is for a different reason, illustrates the falsity, I think, of this assumption. We can, of course, in principle, there's nothing to stop us from fitting infinitely many events into a finite amount of time. Again, anyone who knows physics can see this from the case which runs forwards in time. So if you imagine a very simple Newtonian model of a ball bouncing on a flat surface with a certain coefficient of elasticity, each bounce of the ball will take a certain, say each time the ball hits the surface, then bounces up slightly lower, and then bounces up slightly lower. Each bounce might take, let's say, 50% of the time of the one that preceded it. If the first bounce took 10 seconds, infinitely many bounces will have been completed in 20 seconds. There we have infinitely many events taking place in a finite amount of time. Now, those laws are reversible in time. We could make a film of that sequence of events, play it backwards, and now we've got infinitely many events of which there was no first one. There's nothing impossible about that. No incoherence at all. If there is an incoherence, perhaps Abdullah could tell us what it is. I'm not aware of any incoherence in that or any difficulty in accounting for the universe in that way. One other point that I'll make about this is that, of course, even if we think that the universe is finite in time, as I guess people do think, the universe began between 13 and 14 billion years ago, there are theories according to which it wasn't just space that began at that moment, it was space and time. In fact, it's incoherent even to distinguish between space and time in the way that we customarily do. So that time itself began 14 billion years ago, and there was no time beforehand when nothingness was hanging around waiting for the universe to come into existence. There was no time before that point 14 billion years ago. So again, no problem arises. There was no question as to what happened the time before the universe began in order to bring it into existence. There was no moment when the universe didn't exist. The two assumptions of Abdullah's argument, as I said, were first of all that reality is limited. First of all that what is limited needs an explanation, and secondly that reality itself is limited. I've argued that both of those assumptions are false. The step, even if we grant those assumptions, we grant that reality needs some kind of explanation, the step from those assumptions to the conclusion that the explanation has to be A, infinite, and B, possessed of intention, was, I'm afraid, completely opaque to me. I just don't see how it can follow. How that can follow. Let me say a little bit about what does count as a good explanation versus a bad explanation in areas with which we're familiar, so where we can distinguish what, explanation according to rational criteria. A good explanation of something is something that actually makes predictions that you wouldn't expect, which then turn out to be true. That's what a good explanation is. If you think about, for instance, the nuclear model of the atom versus the model of the atom in which charge was distributed uniformly across it, the nuclear model of the atom is a good explanation of what atoms are made of, if you want to put it in those crude terms, because it explained what Thomson observed. It explained the deviation of charged particles. It made a prediction which we then found to be true. Now, if this supposed explanation of reality, which is that it was created by an infinite being with intention, actually makes predictions about things that we haven't observed, and those predictions are borne out to be true, and other theories don't make those predictions, that's an argument for it. That would be a good explanation. So then my next question would be, can we hear one of those predictions, please? Otherwise, I see no reason to think this is remotely plausible. It seems a completely hopeless explanation of something which, I submit, didn't need to be explained in the first place. Let me move on now to the issue concerning values, whether we need God to be the basis for values. There are various questions here that seem to have been tangled up in the preceding discussion, so I'll just say a little bit. But Abdullah made interesting points about all of them, so I'll just try and disentangle them and then say a bit about why I think some of the things he said were false. You can distinguish, first of all, the question whether we need God to exist in order for there to be such a thing as moral conduct, from the question whether we need God to exist in order for there to be a distinction between right and wrong in the first place. Let me start with the first one, because I think Abdullah did talk about it towards the end of his discussion when he said, incentivizing people in terms of self-interest or enlightened self-interest won't persuade them to act morally. But my own belief in a divinity will, give them a reason to act morally, will persuade them to act morally. Well, first of all, it should be evident to everyone, from mainly from the plain facts of history, that there have been people, and there no doubt will continue to be people, who act morally without any belief in God at all, or certainly without any belief in anything like the Christian, Jewish, or Islamic God. We can take plenty of examples from antiquity of people. I suppose Socrates is an example that might be contested, or if we take people who are not only enlightened people but very profound ethical thinkers like Marcus Aurelius or Aristotle or Plato, there's a tradition not only of ethical action but ethical thought, completely divorced from any religious form of belief, and that of course is a very rich tradition that goes on to this day under the name of ethics and is a branch of philosophy. There's also, of course, plenty of evidence that in countries where people are more secular, the kinds of acts that none of us have any difficulty in distinguishing as virtuous as opposed to vicious, are more prevalent. So that, for instance, if you think of the countries with the lowest crime rates, the lowest homicide rates, let's say, in the world, if you look at those countries such as Switzerland or Denmark or Japan, none of these are religious countries. In fact, these countries, if anything, are marked by their strong tendency towards secularism. So again, there's plenty of evidence that moral conduct can exist, and these people presumably have motivations to behave morally that are quite independent of religious beliefs. So moral conduct can exist and be motivated quite independently of any belief in a divinity. Setting aside that point, it just seems odd to me that the sorts of motivations that belief in God provide could be said to be motivations for moral conduct. The sorts of motivations, the sort of incentive that Abdullah mentioned, well, in fact he mentioned two. The one he seemed to focus on was the motivation that involved self-interest. If one thinks one is going to be punished after one dies, or horrible things are going to happen to one after one dies, if you steal, or lie, or cheat, or murder, that you might refrain from murder, but you are not doing so out of a moral motive. Any more than someone who's trying to rob a bank and you put a gun to their head to stop them from robbing a bank. That doesn't make their refraining from robbing the bank some kind of moral self-restraint. That makes it a self-interested act. So the question is, are the people who, like all of you, like all of us, who don't kill and don't lie and don't steal, are we doing it out of a moral motivation, or are we doing it out of a self-interested motivation? If we are doing it out of a moral motivation because we respect other people, or because we love other people, or because we don't want to lie, or be dishonest, or cheat, if we're doing it out of a moral motivation, appealing to God adds nothing to that. It doesn't make you any more moral. And if you're doing it out of a self-interested motivation, then again, appealing to God doesn't turn a self-interested act into a moral one. It simply turns it into enlightened kind of selfishness. The other sort of source of motivation that Abdullah mentioned for moral action was the intention of the creator. So this is towards the beginning of this section of his talk, where he said that what makes something right or wrong is because it's in accordance with the intention of the person who created it. Now, there's one difficulty with that is that we have to ask, where does this moral obligation come from? The obligation to do the thing that your creator wanted you to do. Is that an independent obligation that exists independently of God's will? In which case there can be moral obligations that are independent of his will. Or does it not? And if it doesn't, why are we obliged to obey it? Indeed, it seems a very suspicious thing to me in the first place to say that one's always obliged to obey the intentions of whoever it was who created one. I can see no basis for that. Certainly, my belief that it's wrong to steal and it's wrong to lie and it's wrong to kill people, the difference between honesty and dishonesty, the difference between kindness and selfishness, those differences are much more clear to me and much more clear to any atheist than is this rather dubious claim that one's always obliged to do what your creator intended for you. The second sort of issue, which I think Abdullah did talk about briefly, and so I'll also talk about it briefly, was to do with whether belief in a divinity is something that is necessary for the existence of a distinction between right and wrong in the first place. Now here again, in some ways, some of the things I would want to say actually repeat what I've said earlier, so I won't dwell on it at great length. Instead, I'll just talk briefly about one very obvious objection to this idea that's been in existence for the last 2,000 years, which is that what is it that makes killing wrong? What is it that makes stealing wrong? What is it that makes lying wrong? Is it because God says it's wrong? Or is it the other way around? Does God tell us not to do it because it's already wrong? If it's the second, if God tells us not to do these things because they're already wrong, then again, the distinction between right and wrong exists independently of his will. If, on the other hand, and this seems the only alternative, we simply define right and wrong as whatever it is that God commands, then we seem to end up with a kind of absurd arbitrariness that, that distinguishes God in no way from any other despot. If he tells us that murder is wrong, that murder is fine, then murder is fine. If he tells us that these other horrible things, however horrible you might want them to be, are permissible or even mandatory, then they are morally permissible or morally mandatory. The idea of defining what's right and wrong in terms of the command of a person who happens to be very powerful seems to me the very opposite of the spirit of morality, and, to its credit, the very opposite of the spirit of religion itself. One of the great things that religion has done, I mean all religions, not just Islam, but also Christianity and Judaism, is that it has promoted in the individual opposition to authority, opposition to despotism in this world. I have no time in general, for instance, for the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church did a great service to the human race in Poland, for instance, during the Cold War, when it motivated people to resist the murderous regime there. Let me say finally one other thing concerning what Abdullah said about my views concerning Islam in particular. Yes, I do think that there are many things in Islam that are contrary to values that I hold most important. But I certainly would reject the implication that I think intolerance is the best response to that. I think the best response to that, as it is with any serious view that I regard as incompatible with my own values, is to give it the freedom to speak and the freedom to promote its views wherever it wishes, and to argue against them. And that's what I've tried to do tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Arif for his, well, it's more of a rebuttal rather than a presentation. Maybe if I should go second next time. So let's look at what he said, and let's see if there's any merit to any of the arguments or rebuttals he put forward. So he said that, how do I know reality? I suppose he was implying that how do I know reality is finite. I said, let's just look at finite reality. I'm not going to make any assumptions about how big the universe is. Let's just look at finite reality and begin our question from there, like I would say just how the goldfish would be inside the bowl. They wouldn't know how big the world is outside the bowl, but they would start their questioning from inside the bowl to make a deduction about the ultimate cause of all things. He said that a good explanation makes predictions. I say that we're having an after-the-fact discussion about the creation of something that already came into existence. It's not necessary to make predictions. Scientists won't make predictions when they discuss the Big Bang or what could have caused the Big Bang, because they're talking about something that's happened in the past. We have to wait for another Big Bang to come along in order to make where the discussion of predictions makes any sense. So we're talking about an after-the-fact discussion about something happening in the past, not something happening in the future. He said that it wasn't clear in my presentation where intentionality of a creator comes from. Well, my point was that the creator is the first cause and nothing compels this first cause to make the universe. Then the only alternative left is that whatever made this universe did it on its own initiation, which is the definition of will or intentionality, and therefore that's how I say that's where intention comes from. He said infinite regress could be, well, he argued against my point that infinite regress is impossible. I said, well, here's the thing. An infinite regress, as I said, if we had to wait an infinite amount of time before leaving this theatre, we were told that we're not allowed to leave this theatre until an infinite amount of time had passed, would we ever leave? Well, no, we wouldn't. If we were told that in order for this event to start, that we have to wait an infinite amount of time, the event would never begin. And that's my point. It's why I know there is no infinite regress prior to this point, and why there can never be. He argued that there's a possibility of having infinite regress going into the future. We said no, because at any point in time you could press the stopwatch on that and it would only be a finite, an ever-increasing finite amount of time at any point in time in the future. He said that there could be an infinite distance between any 2 points. Well, no, and I think scientists generally argue that there is the smallest amount of space, I think it's called a Planck space, where there's the smallest amount, but it's like discrete units. To get from one side of the computer to the other, you have to kind of traverse an amount of pixels. So there's not an infinite amount of distance you have to traverse between any 2 points, because if that was the case, you couldn't get to any 2 points. Just use an example. If I had a balloon and I draw one dot on one side and one dot on the other side, and I expanded it infinitely, you could never get from one point of the balloon to the other. So the fact that I can get from London by plane to New York means that there's a finite amount of distance between the two. He said that there was no time before 14 billion years ago. That's a great speculation. Please give me your evidence. Let's base our comments on evidence, please. He said that there was no moment where the universe didn't exist. More speculation from an apparently omniscient interlocutor who knows what the entire existence of the universe from is infinite past, apparently. Again, let's not mix speculation with a discussion on rationality. He says... what other points did he say? Why does limited things require cause? Well, because we have to explain why they are limited to that particular degree that they do. The whole premise of science is to study what delimits things and why they have these characteristics being born of their limitations, their characteristics, their form, and their consistency. If we want to throw this out, then we might as well throw out science along with it and rationality, because that's the whole premise of it. He said, why can't anything be arbitrary? Well, because I like to question things. I don't want to just say, let's believe it, it's there because it's there. Let's not ask any further questions. We should be inquisitive. We should ask. We shouldn't just accept things as just being arbitrary in causation. He said, well, in modern science, atoms decay at no deducible moment in time. This is an argument from ignorance, an argument from current human ignorance into the science. Why is it? Is it so random? Yet the rate of decay is constant. The rate of decay of radioactive materials are constant, and yet he's saying it's a random thing? No. So why do atoms choose? Why do atoms choose to decay? Well, that's something that we have to investigate, and maybe our descendants will discover this in some scientific lab. Let's not speculate and say, throw up our hands, say, nothing makes sense anymore, and throw it out. I'm very glad our ancestors didn't do that when they studied science. Sure. As for morality, he says countries that exist with a low crime rates, and the majority of people, or a significant group of people, are not religious. I can give counterexamples. Austria and Switzerland have the lowest crime rates, lower than Denmark and Sweden, and they have a higher proportion of religious people. You forgot Estonia and Latvia, and of course, I'm not even going to mention North Korea, but let's just stick with Latvia and Estonia. Highest degree of atheists, highest degree of murder rate in Europe. It falls down. Now, time is very limited, and I won't be able to say to finish other points he mentioned. However, I really want to kind of stress this point. He says, just because he thinks Islam is a threat to the West, doesn't mean he advocates intolerance of Muslims. I say, well, that's great you think that, but Douglas Murray, another atheist, argues, he kind of continues it to its logical conclusion. If Islam is a threat, an existential threat to the West, then by logical extension, every Muslim must also be a threat to the West. And as Douglas Murray said, conditions for Muslims must be made worse across the board, to paraphrase what he said, because that's the logical conclusion. If you believe that, I haven't heard him justify why right and wrong should be followed for anyone. I haven't seen him bring an argument that right and wrong can be even justified, or any consistent basis for morals. My argument is any consistent basis of morals can ever be posited by someone who is an atheist. Outside of just, no consistent basis of morals. And I think that's about it, from more or less. I might have missed out a few points, and hopefully I'll come to his, I will deal with his rebuttals in the Q&A, but thanks for listening.
Okay, terrific, thank you. Well, I did actually address a number of the things that I've said, so perhaps I could just come back on some of them, go into some of them in a bit more detail. One of the issues that he raised that was interesting concerned my remarks about explanation. I said that a good explanation of something is one that makes predictions about other things that we haven't yet observed, and that's a reason for accepting the explanation. And his response was that in this case, as in, of course, all cases of explanation, we are trying to explain something that's already happened and that we've already observed. Of course, that's true. What one explains is something that's already happened, or at any rate that one has already observed. It doesn't follow that what distinguishes a good explanation from a bad one is that it makes predictions about other things that you haven't yet observed, or that you wouldn't otherwise have expected. And indeed, the origins of the universe is a good example. We can have a whole variety of theories concerning the origins of the universe, from the steady state to the Big Bang, to various theories about the way things were at the Big Bang. And the way to test them is to find out which ones make predictions that are borne out by the evidence concerning later states of the universe. So that, for instance, if we thought the steady state theory was true and the universe never had a beginning, we might expect now to observe things that we don't in fact observe. And similarly with other theories concerning the Big Bang. So it's simply false to say that because explanations deal with things that we've already observed, therefore we can't select amongst explanations on the basis of their predictions about things that we haven't. Is that something I should do? Okay, thank you. He also made various comments concerning infinite regresses, of which I shall only discuss a couple. I think Abdullah said that I believe that there could be an infinite distance between 2 points. I certainly don't believe that. I'm sorry if I said that. That was a mistake. If I did say it, I don't think it affects any of the arguments that I made. He asked me for evidence that, for instance, there was no time before the beginning of the universe. No, it's true. I can't give you decisive evidence that that's true. All I'm saying is That's a hypothesis. For all we know, that's true. And unless we can rule it out, we have no reason to believe his second premise. On the point about randomness and radiation and so on, there's a couple of points to make there. Yes, of course, it's true that radiation obeys certain stochastic laws, and that's how we can predict with a fair degree of accuracy how much of a certain block of uranium is going to be left after a certain amount of time. Of course we can. It doesn't change the fact that it's random. The fact there are stochastic laws doesn't mean that things don't ever happen at random. It just means that on the whole and on average, or in the long run, you're going to expect certain kinds of patterns. And of course, the randomness that's built into the quantum theory might well be much more systematic than merely ignorance. So if you think about, for instance, the ways in which anyone who knows the Bell inequalities and why, cases where they fail, it's, the point is not only that, we get certain correlations that we observe in nature, but that the whole idea there are hidden variables that explain those correlations by some prior cause has to be ruled out because of the violation of the Bell inequalities. So it's not just, the quantum theory is an interesting case, not just because it exhibits apparent randomness in nature, many things do that. It's a case where there seem to be theoretical reasons why certain kinds of explanation of the correlations we observe just are not available, and that's part of the theory. And of course, it may be that there are explanations that we don't know about, but simply labelling our ignorance with the word God is not an explanation, I think, nor even an attempt at an explanation, at least judging by the criteria for explanation that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'll move on briefly to the ethical questions. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes, thank you. On the issues concerning values and their basis in God. On the point about examples, yes, it's true, one can very easily choose this example or that example. The biggest study that I know, which is the one by Zuckerman, shows that there isn't much of a relation, there certainly is no positive relation between religiosity in society and peacefulness or having a low crime rate. If there is anything, there's a correlation in the other direction. Of course, nobody's saying that correlation implies a causal connection. The point is only that it is perfectly possible, and history and the statistical facts in our time bear out that it does in fact happen, that you can have societies which are generally peaceful, generally law-abiding, and indeed generally happy, where religion plays no significant role. That's all that I'm saying, and that seems to be something that's evidently borne out by the facts, unless there's something wrong with the study that I mentioned, or unless there's something that I'm missing there. On the point concerning motivation to be moral, I think I should just repeat what I said earlier. I simply do not see how someone who is acting out of self-interest can be acting out of a moral motivation. The only reason we've been offered for believing in a divine basis for morality is that gives people a self-interested motivation. But that's not a moral motivation. If there's something wrong with my example about Robert, then perhaps you could hear what it is. There are other things, and I hope we'll have a chance to get onto them in the discussion, but the last thing I wanted to mention, which was just to do with Abdullah's final comment. Yes, I know Douglas Murray has said various things. I certainly disagree with those things that Douglas Murray has said. I mean, for me, the values of free speech and tolerance are so important and so fundamental to Western values that includes tolerance of all of those who profess values that are inconsistent with it. And of course, I should say, I disagree, of course, with many of the things Douglas Murray and other people who hold my views on these matters believe about Islam and foreign policy. I think, for instance, it's been a disaster, the way in which we've supported the State of Israel, for instance, and in which we have connived in the continued oppression of the Palestinian people. I think it's the greatest tragedy that's taken place since the Second World War, and it's the cause of all the major problems, almost all the major problems of the world, certainly in that region. So my views on those matters are completely different from those of Douglas Murray or Sam Harris or whoever these people are. I certainly shouldn't infer anything about my political views concerning foreign policy from my belief that God is not necessary for values. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up now to either comments or questions from the floor. So we don't have to have a response to each one, but if it obviously you do have a question, then I'll invite our speakers to respond. I think the first hand I saw was just there.
Before you start, could you just repeat the questions when people give them? Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to make a comment that would lead on to a question. So I feel like the entire most part of the speech of Elandelsi here was based on the entire premise of which you made in the beginning, using the analogy of the rock being created. Hence, it makes sense that in nature itself has to be designed in a creative fashion. However, you actually yourself made a good argument why this is not a case, since you used the examples using absolute, saying absolute conclusion of the ocean, making a conclusion based on that, using a fish in a fishbowl is fallacious. But that is also the same regarding the word created, because the word created is very subjectively and very much based on a human level understanding how things work. It's by no means necessary that whatever our logics dictate must be, that's how the natural world, including the universe, must also be. So I find it quite ironic that your own argument kind of points to that conclusion itself. So my question is regarding this, since the entire speech is based on, how do you know you're not already living in a world where God doesn't exist, neither is necessary to have a virtuous or values-based life, yet you're believing God because it's based on the concept of virtue, which itself is not dependent on any religious or non-religious affiliation? How is that not the reason why you live a good-based moral life instead of the idea of a God? So secondly, I would basically say, why is that less the case than God, essentially? Yeah.
Okay, well, firstly, I use a more technical term than create. I said define, definis, to met out a portion or shape or put boundaries. And so, if you don't like the word create, I can use the word define if you want, or we can go Latin if you want, if that's what you prefer. I also want to make a point that I'm not even actually speculating as to what caused or created this particular bubble of our existence or this universe, because it could be bigger than this universe. Reality itself, finite reality, could be bigger than this universe. It's a speculation for anyone to say that this universe is all that there is, because we haven't seen beyond that. So that's actually speculation that I didn't indulge in. I'm merely saying that ultimately, however big the finite reality is, finite reality requires an infinite reality. That's the only thing I ever said. And even many atheists have actually concluded the same point, although they don't attribute agency to this infinite reality. They say it's a multiverse or what have you. But many then conclude it's an infinite reality for those who want to speculate as to giving it a name. They call it multiverse.
I want to move on to bring in more voices. I think you would.
Within the first 2 minutes, Abdullah, you compared the study of reality to the study of the finite, which to me betrayed a fundamental misunderstanding of the study of mathematics and therefore all of science, which is dependent on mathematics. I could provide you right now with an example of an infinite event which results in a finite result. And therefore, why should we listen to the rest of your argument, which is based on such a fallacious beginning?
Give me an example.
Okay, so begin with the number 1, and then add 0.5 to that number, and you result in 1.5. Add half of 0.5 to that, you result in 1.75. Continue this on infinitely, and the limit is 2. This is a very basic result in mathematics. So if you do not understand this, and therefore you argue that the study of reality, of which mathematics is a part, is fallacious and only finite, then the rest of your argument is surely fallacious.
Okay, let me disabuse you of perhaps a misconception regarding mathematics. People have said the number line is an infinite thing. The number line goes on forever. It's not. Numbers are a counting rule. Mathematics, or the number line anyway, whatever you want to call it, it's a counting rule. To count what humans can conceive and what humans can observe and what have you, we use it, or what computers now can calculate. But at all points in time, you'll need, it's always, we're looking at finite amounts, we're dealing with actual finite amounts. In physics, if they have an equation which causes or predicts an infinite result, they have to fudge it, and it's called renormalization. Because if it produces an infinite result, they know that it's mistaking the equation, and they have to adjust it. You see? So maths is a counting rule, it's a tool, let's just say, a intellectual measuring stick. But the intellectual measuring stick can only measure what is finite. And we shouldn't be confused just because the number line, it can go on forever if you can go on forever, or but you can't, so to speak. So it's a counting rule. So let's not have any misconceptions as to what mathematics is or isn't.
So first, I'd like to thank both speakers for taking all the time and patience for coming here. So before I ask my question, I'm going to give a bit of context, right, regarding morals. So I'm an engineer, and oftentimes I have some moral decisions that I have to take myself. So for example, if a company comes to me and says that we need your input on certain nuclear technology, I could either say that I'm going to help them, or I could say that I'm not going to help them, depending on whether I know what that company is going to be doing with that technology. So for example, if they're using that technology to do something good like generating electricity, then I might help. But if I know that they're going to use that technology to kill innocent people, then I should refrain. Otherwise, I think I'm morally responsible for their deaths. Because without me, those people would have survived. Right? Now, in the sense, in the scenario, I know Arif is not going to like this scenario, but in the scenario that God does exist, you say that He is omnipotent, meaning that, do you agree that He can see the past, the present, and the future? Right?
Well, there's nothing outside his power. I know. Okay,
Yeah.
you're going this, but continue. Yeah.
So before He makes something, He knows the outcome of what exactly that's going to be. So before He made Hitler, He knew what he was going to be capable of doing. Yet knowing that Hitler is going to be doing so many immoral things, he still went ahead with it. So my question is, how can you say that even if God does exist, that He is a moral God?
Okay. So it's a typical argument. They call it the problem of evil. It's not really the problem of evil per se for theists, because reality is that you're making an assumption. And the assumption is that God made humans in this life to have unlimited happiness and joy and justice and what have you. And that's. But we see suffering, we see problems in this world. We see obviously evil people and evil things. Now, instead of just saying, oh, maybe my thesis is wrong about why God made us. No, we just say, no, why is God immoral? No. God made us for a purpose beyond just experiencing unlimited happiness. Suffering and happiness are part of our existence. So this would then disprove, and I would call it a kind of liberal theology, the belief that it's all kind of happiness, love, and so on and so forth. It's not why God made us. God made us to test us with these moral situations, to show our true colors. When we see evil and suffering, it is only then we have a test as to what we do about it. You understand? So Hitler arose, and humanity was tested as what to do with Hitler. How should we do it? Should we tolerate it, or should we not? And of course, many people chose, thankfully, not to tolerate Hitler and to redress that evil. Not initially, though, of course. And when he was persecuting Jews in Germany, you don't see Winston Churchill offering an ultimatum to Germany saying, stop persecuting Jews or we declare war on you. No. It was, get out of Czechoslovakia. That was their concern at the time. Again, due to the bigotry that was there pervading throughout Europe at the time. But when evil gives the opportunity to test people what to do in that situation, are you going to sacrifice or put yourself at risk to object to evil and to oppose evil? Are we going to do the easy route, take the easy route and just let it spread? And that's, in a way, evil and good are there to test us, to show our true colours, and that's the whole point of our existence.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
I have a relatively simple question for both of you. From what I heard in the talk, I think Arif makes the three basic assumptions that reality is real, we have something to learn from reality, and that predictive models that we create are more useful than models that don't predict anything. And yours was similar, except that I feel you assert that reality is real, and therefore we need to understand reality, and then you assume that God is real. So my question is, what basic assumptions and basic assertions do you make in your philosophy, if that question makes sense?
To me or to Arif?
To both of you.
I'm happy to start. I think on basic assumption, in a way, the things that you've already said, you put it up very nicely. Yes, I think reality is real, we can learn from it, and models that make predictions are better than ones that don't. Yeah. All of those things are things I believe. Perhaps just take the opportunity just to add one thing, which is in connection with your question and one gentleman earlier who asked a question which I thought Abdullah completely failed to answer, which was that the point is that you can fit an infinite amount of things into a finite space, right? Logic doesn't tell you that you can't do that. So logic doesn't tell you there's an infinite past. Physics doesn't tell you there's an infinite past, reality of the past. So what does tell us that? So that's another question. Maybe you can answer that after you're interested.
Okay. Well, to put simply, reality is real, and I'm not going to be a solipsist or a nihilist in the matter by just saying that we're experiencing something, and whether that something is accurate or not, obviously, are we in the matrix or are we in is it brain in the vat or what have you? Whether that might be the case is fine, but we know that there's a reality there. Even the matrix has a reality, which is programming, if it ever existed. It doesn't exist, of course. We hope. Right? And even if we were all in the matrix or we're all brain in the vat, I could still deduce that even if there's malevolent daemons or aliens controlling it, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, there's still an ultimate cause. I can still deduce that without me knowing the full reality or the full nature of the reality around me. I just know that there's finite reality, and that's it. That's why I use the word finite reality. As to the point that my colleague has mentioned about infinite amount of things can fit into a finite amount of space, please give me the empirical reality, since you've always said you're an empiricist. Please give me any empirical reality where we've seen this to be the case. I'm not even going to even address that philosophically. I'm just going to ask, give us an empirical reality whereby an infinite amount of things can be fitted into a finite amount of space. It doesn't make sense, and we never observed it.
Can we move on to the next question? That's
I'm sorry, but I'd like to stick on infinities for a little while.
Please. We're going to spend an infinite amount of time on it, it seems.
I feel like some of your arguments portray a bit of a lack of understanding about how infinite series of events, time or space, actually behave. You're clearly not a finitist because you actually posited the existence of an infinite reality, as you called it, outside of our own for some reason. And so, but when you were refuting one of your opponent's suggestions that you could have a going forward in time, an infinite series of events, you said this could not be infinite because if you were to stop it at any point, you'd still have a finite series of events. But can you suggest a different type of infinity where if you were to stop it at any point, you would not? Because you clearly, because that's the way those things would behave. If you want to stop it, then you've stopped it, and you've got a segment of infinity. So,
okay, okay. I mean, we're now going into the abstract, but let's go into it. So I said that an infinite series going ahead. I said it's impossible. I said it's impossible because you can never reach the infinite end of that infinite series going ahead in the future. Because if you stopped the watch at any point in time, then you would only a finite amount of time that has passed. So my argument was that infinite series in the future is impossible as much as infinite series in the past is also impossible. And the fact that there's contradictions when you bring the word infinity into these finite discussions is proof in point that infinity doesn't exist within finite things, which is why there has to be an infinite reality which is not finite in any way, shape or form. And it's why that I posit that is, you can call it, I call it God. If you don't like it, you can call it Deus, you can call it Theo, you can call it what have you. But that's why I posit, and I call that God.
So how could that infinite reality behave? Because you said yourself that you could not actually get infinite things do not work, or you cannot have an infinite series of events.
No, I said you can't mix infinity with finitude or what is finite. You can't mix them, and that's my only point. So if you were to say that a human being, any particular human being is God, I'd say, well, that's false, because a human being is finite and God is infinite. And so that's also our argument against idolatry, but is that what is finite cannot be God, and that's really our point. So don't mix the infinite and finite, and that's really my consistent message here today.
Next we have a question over here.
Thank you for your speech. I would ask you to start. First, I believe that the values can be in any human, if it's a religious man or not. It's okay. But my question: how we can explain the moral behavior in kids and animals? Because sometimes we can see that animals and kids making good things without really understand the meaning of ethics and the meaning of morality, because they are not an adult. So how we can explain that there is not a powerful force against God or anything else that put that aside?
Is that the question for me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm happy to answer. Thank you. I mean, I'll observe first of all that if the explanation for why humans behave morally was supposed to be that belief in a divinity provides certain kinds of incentives to do so, that would be hopeless as an explanation for the behaviour that you're right to observe that we see in, for instance, animals. So the question, I think, tells no more against me than against the other side. Moving on to actually answering it, and is answering the question, how would you explain it? It is an empirical question, and there are various reasonable stabs that people have had at answering it. For instance, you might think there's an evolutionary explanation. So if you think that evolution occurs at the level of groups rather than at the level of individuals, you might expect groups in which cooperation occurs, within which cooperation occurs, to flourish and to survive better than groups in which the individuals are constantly at loggerheads. And that's why it's not surprising that we observe in societies today, for instance amongst ants and bees as well as amongst human beings, natural tendencies to cooperative behaviour. That's one sort of explanation. There might be other sorts of psychological explanations. The only thing I'd say, I'm not going to pin myself to any one particular explanation, because I'm not an expert in these things, and I wouldn't want to say something that was just purely speculative. But I would just say, it would be too hasty to say simply because we can't, simply because we can't see off the top of our heads exactly what it might be, that there couldn't be any sort of psychological or evolutionary explanation. I think there are several promising possibilities.
I mean, interject just regarding the point very quickly. When we talk about social behaviour in human beings, and humans are social creatures, and so we have desires to be kind and compassionate to each other. And then people point to animals and say, animals, they have the same behaviours too. What they tend to ignore is animals have other behaviours as well, just our nearest primates, as you can say. There's cannibalism, there's murder, there's rape. People looked at penguins, they all operate in a community, yet some penguins steal stones to make that other penguins make a nest from each other. You can see on YouTube a very famous video, one penguin stealing stones from another penguin who's trying to build his own nest. And because of that, he gets much more stones and has greater chance of attracting a mate. So we see that doing bad things has given benefit to animals, and they do it. Cannibalism, rape, and murder within primates, right? Within monkeys and apes and so on and so forth. So my point is this: humans have desires which are coincidentally moral and not coincidentally immoral. The question is, sure, morality, a desire that humans have which are moral doesn't need to be obviously addressed. But what about if humans have a desire to be immoral, to cheat on their partners, for example, when no one's looking? What would stop them from doing so if there's no consequence to it and no one would find them out and they don't have any guilt about it? That's the question, and that's where a person who doesn't believe in any higher ideals out beyond the physical would struggle to do so beyond maybe the mental conditioning their parents put into them or society's norms. That's one of my only points.
Next question is
So the definition of moral is something that you should do, and because we have to choose it, because there wouldn't be a point if it was just an obligation we blindly obliged to. There has to be a reason of why we should do the thing that is moral. So the question of the moral is, what is it that I should rather, or I have more reasons to do than not to? So it would be weird to say that killing is moral, although I have all the reasons not to do that. So I'm asking you, what differentiates your reasons to do the things that are, in my opinion, quite redundantly labeled moral as, above and beyond the reasons why you should it, and how they compare to somebody who wouldn't have this kind of additional divine inspiration of what is moral. So basically, why are you doing the things that you define as moral, and how do you think it's different from Mr. Arif?
Okay. Well, thankfully, because of, again, parental conditioning in society, as well as my own human nature, a lot of what I desire to do is moral. But the question as to why I'm doing it doesn't need to be brought up until I reach a point, a test, where I'm tested with something which entices me to, which gives me a desire to do something which is not moral according to my set code of ethics, or maybe even general society, and so on. And then we're all tested with this on a daily basis. You're writing your CV or your resume, and everyone's competing for a job, and you think, well, if I just exaggerate here, it's not going to hurt anybody, and I might be lying, but I want to get a job. Isn't getting a job good? And that's a test. So the question is, what would stop a student, not looking at anyone here, but any student, from lying on their CV and exaggerating to get ahead when they don't see any consequence to it? No one's going to arrest them for it, or what have you. But also, you mentioned murder. I know when people have moral debates, they usually go to rape and murder as the big moral questions, and because most people don't have a desire to commit rape and murder. However, well, not unless you ask some extreme feminists who say yes, most people do, right? But no offence to an extreme feminist. But let's look at social conditions where then murder then becomes encouraged. So, for example, in Bosnia and Serbia in the 1990s, for example, the Bosnian Muslims were portrayed as such a big threat to the Serbs and Serbian nationalism and so on and so forth, that the average member of the Serbian army or the volunteers that joined it felt it was necessary and even laudable to execute and kill Bosnian Muslims and Croats to a lesser extent, because they felt they were under threat. And the banality of evil is a problem.
I'm asking why you do the things.
I know you asked me to answer this, but I'm just saying that I want to want you to think about. There are certain conditions that societies we've seen in history, whereby actually committing the big no-nos, murder, has been seen as being encouraged in that society, becoming a norm for that society to do to other societies or to other people, especially minorities. And in the case of in Nazi Germany, for example, we saw that those who were opposing the Nazis, for example, were the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic, by the way, but I'm just saying that many Catholic priests and so on, went to jail, went to concentration camps because they saw that their religion was incompatible with following the Nazi plan and how Nazis demonized Jews. I'm not saying Christians have always had a good record in that, but I'm just saying that was a case where religion went against the national, the propaganda that was purportedly to be in the national interest of the Nazi agenda. So that's what I'm basically saying is that what stops people in such circumstances where the big no-nos have become normalized, what stops them from doing these things? And Hannah Arendt asked this question, The Banality of Evil, in her book, the problem is you'll find few restraints to do so from a materialist basis.
We're reaching the end of our time, and I don't want to take any more questions from people who have already asked a question. But can I ask us now to keep our questions really quite brief and the answers brief as well? So there's a gentleman there in the red who's been waiting for a while.
Probably more of a comment. Actually, just to your last point as well, if you actually look, the Catholic Church was in quite open alliance with the Nazi regime from the get-go. There was only individual Catholics who didn't want to get involved with that rightly. I would say that morals, I don't trust anyone who talks about morals in absolute terms. Killing is wrong, but in some circumstances you may have to kill someone to save other lives. I think the better way is to look at what enhances human well-being, and I think religion is the first attempt to first and the worst attempt to put a kind of code of conduct, but also it evolves over time. So the Quran and the Bible don't say anything explicitly against slavery, for example, but we all know that now to be wrong because we've evolved morally through observation.
Okay, so let's leave that one as a comment. There was a question at the back there. Oh, yes? Sorry, can't quite hear down here.
So I'd like to give a scenario to Arif, and I apologise if this is crude, but say for example you have a brother and sister. This is basically a question of incest. Say you have a brother and sister, or a father and his daughter, a mother and his son, and say they were to embark on a romantic relationship, two consenting adults. Do you have any objection to it? I mean, of course, I'm going to assume you do have an objection to it, because obviously that is not correct. But then, unless you have a divine scripture, as we do, saying you don't know that, go there, don't do that, there's no reason for you to object to that because there are two consenting adults, and let's assume for argument's sake that they won't have kids or whatever. Let's say like one of them is sterilised or whatever. And do you have an objection to it?
Okay, so the question is the basis for the morality against incest.
Yeah, I mean, I can only say a few things about that. In general, the principle that consenting adults can do whatever they like as long as it doesn't harm other people is kind of important to me. I think in the case of incest, there are good reasons why there's a taboo on it, which are principally to do with health benefits. Now, as you said, in the case where they're sterilised and there's no possibility of children, that doesn't become an issue. But that doesn't change the fact that the general principle remains plausible, because the general principle is supposed to apply to the majority of cases, and we're not built to, just to make judgment about these very specific cases without using general principles that we find. Well, I'm not going to object. The law objects, but I'm not going to object. You might find it disgusting, but people find homosexuality, or maybe you find homosexuality disgusting as well. But I'm not going to object to two people who want to do something that doesn't affect anyone else. And you might think that's offensive, but I'm afraid that is what I think.
This is the problem, like, if you don't have divine scriptures, like, as an anchor for your morals, like, your morals
Yes,
change.
that's right. If I don't have somebody else to tell me what to think is right or wrong, I'm going to have to think it for myself.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the final question now. It's Dale.
So this is, sorry. This is Abdullah. I just want to say, a lot of the anti-Semitism actually came out of like right-wing Catholic ideology, mass preceding Nazi Germany. But my question to you is, you have a big go at utilitarian morality. Take an example of perhaps in the capital city, Riyadh, where a crazy CIA member has planted a bomb, an atomic weapon that is going to just decimate Riyadh, killing everyone inside. And the only way to get the information is to torture this CIA guy. You would say that that is utterly wrong, and no amount of human life no amount of human life is worth protecting to the point where you would torture the CIA member.
Okay, well, I would say that the agencies involved in this hypothetical example would attempt to find the bomb as much as possible, and that the individual would, you'd speak to the individual and you try to encourage the individual to divulge and not actually want to kill loads of people. Of course, America doesn't need to plant bombs; they can just send bombs across the Atlantic if they want. But in that particular sense, I'd say that dying and bearing witness to God for what is just and moral is more important than convenience in that sense. So I'd say that. So it wouldn't be allow people to be killed. No, because you would do your best to find the bomb as much as possible. But if you're saying that you have to compromise your morals to do so and the prohibitions of God, well, as Muslims we believe that if someone has the time to die, they're going to die at that point in time, and that should not serve as a basis behind which you should violate people's rights or break the prohibitions of God. And in that society, I ask a counter question: what society would you feel more comfortable in? A society where your right not to be tortured is subject to the convenience of the state, or a right where or a country or a state where your right to not be tortured is protected as absolute? I ask you the question, sir.
So just to clarify, you wouldn't torture anybody to stop that bomb going?
I wouldn't break the prohibitions of Islam on torturing, and I'll get the agencies to search as hard as they can to find the bomb. I wouldn't just do nothing.
No one else could find it, and the person who knew where the bomb was sitting in front of you.
It's a lot of ifs. It's a lot of ifs, but I'm not going to gamble people's.
But in that particular scenario, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, hold it. See, and here's exactly the point. Exactly the point. When it's no longer convenient, then torture is rolled out and could be used by utilitarian ethics, and that's scary. That's exactly my. That's exactly my point, though. It's exactly my point. Sam Harris made the same argument that torture should be allowed. If you can bomb people around the world, then you can also torture them. That was his argument, and I find that morally grotesque.
But you don't find being the agent behind the destruction of a capital city and millions.
Being the agent, it's not.
You could stop it, but you would choose not.
I think we need to. We've said our points on this particular.
It also assumes that torturing would even be successful, but that's not even the discussion.
I'm aware that lots of people still want to come in, but our time is limited, and I did intend to finish it by now. So I'd like to invite our speakers just to have one last shot at saying what kind of fundamental point that has a bearing on this issue you would like us to take away with us. With Arif, would you like to first? Just
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to my co-debater. It's been a lively, interesting debate, and thank you for all your questions. I'll just make a few points. The first 2 points are as follows. First of all, I should repeat, I see no reason to believe either of the premises of Abdullah's argument concerning God's necessity for reality. The issues about affinity, I think, have remained unaddressed in his responses to a number of the questions. And so that argument, I think, remains unsound. Second thing I'd like to say, the next two things I'd like to say concern ethics. One of them actually is bringing up a question that I felt, again, was not properly addressed, which was to do with the problem of evil. Abdullah is right that if evil exists at the hands of man, we can think of that as somehow God testing people's character. But of course, God is also responsible for Ebola and malaria and all the things that have killed millions of African children with no human agency involved at all, natural evils that his God brought about. This is the God, by the way, whose demands on us we're supposed to take as the absolute standard of morality. The third thing I want to say is that there's a whole range of ethical views that are compatible with atheism. You don't have to be some kind of reductivist utilitarian of the most crude sort in order, to be an atheist. You can certainly think that some things are absolutely right or absolutely wrong, absolutely prohibited or not, and yet not believe in God. And whether or not, many people who do hold these views, and if you think about certain political views, they treat certain freedoms as absolute constraints, not merely things to be fed into the utilitarian calculus. Nothing to do with God. More generally, I would say, in answer to one of the most pertinent questions, which is to Abdullah, why do you not do things that are wrong? Why don't you murder people? Why don't you steal people? His answer can only be, because someone really powerful tells me not to. My answer is, because those things are wrong, because they're dishonest, because they harm people, because they're lies. If you don't think that's a good enough stopping point, there's something about morality that you haven't understood. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank the audience and my interlocutor for their contributions. I'd just like to return back to the issue, I suppose, of infinity. And here's the thing, is that my colleague says there was no time before the existence of the universe, and this is his hypothesis, and that's great. All right, that's fine. Then what started it? And this is the problem. If you throw out infinite regress, you're right back to the problem of what started the universe or ultimately created it. If you put back in the infinite regress and say that there is no need for any start point, then you'll reach a rational inconsistency, because then if we had to wait for infinity to reach this point, we'd never reach this point, full stop. So we have to have a start point to the universe and to the finite reality we see around us. And this is something you can't escape from, and no one's really given a credible alternative other than saying, talking about mathematics and so on, which again I have addressed. But he mentioned something very important. He says, you don't need a God to tell you what is wrong and what is right. Well, actually, I think you do, because you had an atheist, presumably, up there saying that torture in certain circumstances is right. And I say that, and my response was, I say that God tells me it's wrong, and so it's wrong, I'm not going to do it, no matter what inducements or incentives or benefits are there, and you've proven my point spectacularly. Thank God I have God tell me that torture is wrong, no matter how beneficial Sam Harris says it is, or that member of the audience says it is, or anyone says it is. Thank God, literally, for that. So I would conclude that, he says, Abdullah says evil in the world due to human agency you can understand, but what about if God's evil? I said, no, God's evil. I said all things which are challenging and all evil, or all things which are detrimental to human beings, all of that is a test for humans. Whether it was from human sources or from God, all of it is a test. And the whole point of humans living in this life, or living in this universe and in reality, is for us to surmount these tests, whether it comes from other humans or from God. I never said just from human beings, so you have to accurately portray what I was saying. And it just brings me right back to my point and the things that he never addressed, which is, in human constructed moralities that justify torture and terrorism, which is John Rawls and his argument for the supreme emergency exemption, these things were not addressed. They were not addressed. There was no safeguards offered as to how do we prevent philosophers, liberal philosophers like John Rawls, saying that in certain circumstances, like in World War II, you can target civilians. Whereas, as John Rawls himself admits, unlike the Catholic doctrine of double effect, and obviously Islamic doctrines which also prohibit it, which prevent the targeting of civilians, the ideology of secular liberalism allows the targeting of civilians if it will bring victory in those circumstances. Thank God that we're not following secular liberalism. Thank God that Catholics and Muslims follow something which is from God and says that in all circumstances, whether it's in World War II or in Sam Harris's ticking time box scenario, God says it's wrong and you should never make it right just because you deem it to be convenient. Our God is God and not human convenience. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to sum up very briefly just by thanking our speakers for what has been a tremendously energising, stimulating and intelligent and articulate debate. And to thank also our audience members for some excellent and challenging and searching questions. So thank you very much. It's been a great event.